Hi, I know that most of you probably know me, but I am Jackie McNeil. I am not only the pastor's wife, I have another identity outside of that. I am a historian of gender and sexuality. And this is fun for me, so I will try to remember, even as I get a little nervous being behind a pulpit here, that, that this is fun for me. I want to start with a couple of definitions and make sure that we are all on the same page to understand, first of all, the difference between sex and gender. Sex is biological. Most people are identified or assigned at birth as male or female. There are people, at least 1% of the population, who are intersex. The term used to be hermaphrodite. In case that's more familiar to you, the term now is intersex. And there's at least 1% of the population. I say at least one because we don't all get gender tested. And I have a friend of a friend who in his late 50s went to the doctor for a problem, and she came back into the room and said, "Are you holding out on me? Is there something you want to tell me?" And he's like, "I don't know what you're talking about." And she said, "You're intersex?" And that was news. So we can all, or most of us, go through life without necessarily knowing that. Gender, unlike sex, is socially constructed. It is created by the society in a particular time and place. And by gender, I mean what we usually talk about as masculinity and femininity, okay? Or androgyny, somewhere in the middle. And I like to think of this sometimes as a spectrum. If you think about this whole space up here as this long spectrum of gender, we're going to put the Hulk over there and Barbie somewhere over there. And my guess is that you and most everyone you know fits somewhere in between the Hulk and Barbie, right? And where we fit on that gender spectrum, where we feel most comfortable, that's usually what we call our gender identity. That's the spot where we feel comfortable. And that spot's unlikely to change through your life. Your gender expression can change. How you present yourself to the world, that can change. And for most of us, that changes on a regular basis. Because how you dress, how you look when you go out gardening is going to be different than how you look when you go out on a date, right? Those are different things usually. So our gender expression can change and frequently does. Our gender identity is unlikely to. And on that long spectrum, I might fit there. Like, feel comfortable there. Which means you can put me in a dress, I look like a man in drag, and am less comfortable. Like, that is not who I am. But that's where I fit is probably right there and always has been. So gender identity is different than gender expression, and gender is different than sex. Everybody's got that so far, our definitions? A lot of our gendered ideas, particularly historically, are based on sex roles, on what the jobs are that were assigned to men and to women. And those sex roles were then kind of defined how you were supposed to present yourself in the world. But we're also going to see that things like race and class also help to define those. And sometimes gender can end up being dangerous. Those gendered ideas. For example, the English settlement at Jamestown, way back in the early 1600s. Those settlers there nearly died from lack of food. And yeah, part of it had to do with all these other things, but part of it was because among Native Americans, in this case the Powhatans, women did the farming. And all of these male settlers at Jamestown didn't want to be perceived as women, and so they were reluctant to go out and farm. They would rather die of starvation than be seen as women, right? It can get dangerous. I say Europe didn't always send their best and brightest. The last thing is that everyone has gender, just as everyone has race. We tend to talk about those things as if they belong only to marginalized groups, but everyone has gender. And unfortunately, in our society, we also gender things. Things like money, things like sports, things like books and music and movies are gendered, which is odd. We'll talk about that a different time. The last piece that I want to talk about in terms of definitions is the difference between prescription and description. What is prescribed as behavior and expectations versus what actually describes how people live. And those are not always the same thing, and often they are not the same thing. And one of the things when I talk about the history of gender today, I'm going to be talking mostly about prescription, but I need you to remember that it doesn't always describe how people actually live their lives. Okay? Deal? Good. So given that gender is socially constructed, we can expect, and we will see, that definitions of masculinity and femininity have changed over time. So we're going to go back now to the 1600s, and in the 1600s we are going to talk primarily about the English colonies in New England and in Virginia, okay? The ideal man at the time, the ideal man was not some buff, muscular creature. The ideal man was as pious as could be. In fact, masculinity was defined in some ways by how close you were to God. And of course, in New England, in Puritan society, how close you were to God was defined by what pew you sat in. Randy, you're a little suspect back there. Because everybody who was close to God sat in the front pews, right? And the people who had the highest status and therefore were obviously closest to God sat or had their houses right next to the church, which of course was in the center of town. So you can literally look at a map of a New England village and say, these are the people who were believed to be closest to God and therefore most manly in the society, right? It's an odd thing, but it is what they believed. And it's a little quirk in their theology because they believed, as good Calvinists, that everyone was predestined, and you couldn't figure out, you couldn't know who was predestined to go to heaven or to hell. But maybe the fact that they were successful, maybe the fact that they lived close to the church or sat in the front pew was evidence that they were going to heaven. It's a little weird thing in their theology, but that's why they set it up. But even as we think about America as this land of opportunity, early American society was very strict about their hierarchies, incredibly strict. And that hierarchy insisted that women, this is the scientific belief of the time, women were imperfect men. In fact, they believed that a woman was just a man who was not fully formed, didn't have enough heat or power in their body to become fully a man, and so they ended up being female. Again, little odd quirks. But that meant that women were defined in Puritan society as, quote, helpmeets. And if they were very good at that, they would be good wives. And if they were not, if they did not fit into the social hierarchy, they were often defined as witches. Carol Carlson, the historian, basically went back and looked at all of the witchcraft accusations in the 1600s and found that you could define who would be seen as a witch by a woman's age. If she was past childbearing years, she obviously was no longer of use to society, most likely a witch. If she owned property and therefore men didn't get to own that property, she was upsetting the social hierarchy and the balance of society and therefore was very likely a witch. And finally, if she did not have a man to control her, definitely a witch. Those are the three primary characteristics that defined who would be accused of witchcraft in colonial society. So those who upset the social hierarchy are literally outside and are often persecuted for that. This is not a surprise, right? The last piece, though, that I want to talk about New England society and throughout the early colonial period is that there were these things called sumptuary laws. Anybody know what sumptuary laws are? They're important because they're coming back, apparently. Sumptuary laws were laws that would make it illegal to dress above your station. To dress above your station. So a laborer could not dress as a merchant because people might be confused when they saw them. But these laws also made it illegal for women to dress as men because they were dressing above their station. I point this out because these laws are coming back. All of a sudden, there are a bunch of states right now that are saying it's pretty illegal for me to dress the way I am right now. Yes, I'm in pants from the men's department. You can tell because they have pockets. Did you know pockets are gendered? They are. And my family jokes about the traditional Christmas present for me is always a sweater from the men's department at Kohl's. Blue sweater from the men's department, yes. So that's colonial New England, right? Men are defined as manly if they are pious, if they are successful. All of this is about how close they are to God and therefore how successful they are as men. And women were defined as good wives if they fit into that social hierarchy and supported those men. We're going to jump down geographically now down to colonial Virginia, and I want to introduce you to Thomasine Hall. I'm guessing not one of the people you encountered in history books ever, but Thomas Hall was assigned at birth as female, was raised female, and was apparently perfectly happy as a girl until her brother went off to join the military. And when that happened, they, in their own words, quote, changed into the fashion of a man and went and joined the military too. And lived as a man for many years. And then after the military, went back and discovered that, well, they could make a living doing needlepoint, and so they did that for a little while in Bristol in England, and then decided they wanted to emigrate to these new colonies, and so changed into the fashion of a man again. And because it was much easier to be a male settler in colonial Virginia than female, and lived life as a man for a long time, until a couple of times put on a dress and wandered about town and were caught wandering about town in a dress. And all of this led eventually to them being physically examined, first by a group of married women, and then by a group of men in town, and then the case sent to the court at Jamestown. And the court at Jamestown basically took a narrative of a life story from Thomasine Hall, who explained how they had lived their lives, and the court eventually said, you know what? We can't decide, and we are very concerned, again, this is going to sound like colonial New England, we are very concerned that you might fool other people. So we are going to make sure that for the rest of your life, you dress as both. They were required to dress in men's clothing with an apron and a bonnet. Now think about that just for a second, because it was designed to make sure that other people weren't confused. But it also sounds remarkably to me like a scarlet letter. So that you are visible from blocks away as being different in society. We're going to come back to Thomasine later. Right now we're going to move forward into the 18th century. And 18th century, of course, brings us the Enlightenment and all kinds of new ideas. In Europe, many of the salons for the Enlightenment thought where people gathered, many of them were run by women, or at least included women. So there was an idea of equality there, equality of the mind at least. But then we get into how that plays out here in the Revolutionary era. And I want to just focus on this one series of letters. And you can tell me what you think of it, or you can ponder it a little bit. We don't have a microphone, so you can't tell me. I have the microphone. Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, they kept up an incredible correspondence, and everything we can tell from their letters is they were absolutely in love, and they were absolutely dependent on each other and had utmost respect for each other. And yet, in that series of letters, we also come across this. Abigail Adams writing to John while he was involved in the Continental Congress. She says, "And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." Boom. And John wrote back, April 1776. "As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians and Negroes grew insolent to their masters, but your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the rest, were grown discontented. This is rather too coarse a compliment, but you are so saucy I won't blot it out. Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know they are little more than theory." Think about those letters for a minute. And think about, perhaps, the way in which a certain Declaration of Independence was written with, "You must acknowledge that we are all born equal." And King George going, "Ha, that's funny, I can't but laugh." Because to me, those are the same thing, right? Those are the same. You say you're equal, that's so funny. Let's see what happens. Beneath this banter lay two different realities. First is that Abigail was solely responsible for maintaining John's business and his farm while he was away. First at the Continental Congress and all the stuff in Philadelphia, later when he was a diplomat overseas. Her job is to basically make sure everything goes fine, and she does it really well. But second, remember that women, white women, will not get legal citizenship for another 150 years. Staggering, right? And what did women get instead? Women got a concept called Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood, which meant we honor women enough to think that they should have a good education so they can educate the next generation of male citizens. Your role in the new republic is as mother, dictated there. We're going to jump forward now to the 19th century, the 1800s, and a whole lot changes in the 19th century. Obviously, in terms of American history, we have westward expansion, the decimation of more native peoples, development of an industrial economy, a brutal war over slavery, and a whole new understanding of gender. While the 17th century may have viewed women as imperfect men, not fully formed, the 19th century, and 19th century science, I should add, defined men and women as fundamental opposites. Opposites, not like just a little different, opposite. Victorian ideology, this whole idea that came out of this, is that men and women were so different that they had to be opposite of each other. So if men were strong, women were weak. If men were rational, women were emotional, right. If men were inherently sinful, women were angelic. At least white, middle, and upper class women were angelic. In fact, they were almost untouchable. Men of the time, middle class men, write about these women as being on pedestals, so unbelievably pious that they cannot be imagined. But men were also viewed as being inherently sexual, even beast-like, and therefore women were asexual, untouchable. These women, in fact, were so angelic that we see a declining birth rate for the first time in human history. Victorian ideology gave women the right to say no, and they did. But if men are inherently sexual and their wives are untouchable, we might also see a rise in prostitution, which we also see in the 19th century, and the development of what you may all recognize as a split between good girls and bad girls. Those who will and those who won't, those who can and those who are not allowed, right? And this becomes very much focused on things like race and class and immigration status. Newer immigrants from Eastern Europe were often viewed as those women who could be violated because they were not pure and pious. I want to add to this that this 19th century also sees the rise of industrialization, and early industrialization is in some ways comparable to starting a business. And starting a business then as starting a business now requires an incredible amount of self-discipline, right? Penny pinching, long hours, hard work, right? All of this sense of self-discipline and control. And that becomes the definition of manhood in the early 19th century, at least among this group of becoming middle class. We don't even actually have a middle class yet, but it's starting. And upper class white men is this sense of incredible control and self-discipline. If you are that kind of self-disciplined, you are obviously a man to be admired. And this self-discipline is in the bedroom, it's in the marketplace, and it's in the saloon. We see the rise of the temperance movement that's targeted towards men drinking. Obviously, you can't drink, you must be more disciplined, you must be more self-controlled. And there are some people who took this to extremes. Has anybody ever heard of Sylvester Graham? You know Sylvester Graham? He is. He's the father of the graham cracker. Sylvester Graham believed that everyone is born with a limited life force. And in any way that you used that life force, it depleted you. And so he was a big advocate of mom's homemade bread, hated alcohol, sex, and any kind of spicy food, and developed the graham cracker. I think he would have hated s'mores, but the graham cracker was all Sylvester Graham, because it was so much about this idea of self-restraint. And he went across the country and had followers everywhere. How much can we hold in? The other major change in the Victorian era is the development of what are called separate spheres, what we think of as separate spheres, gendered spheres. Because in this time of industrialization, it's the first time really that there is a workplace that is separate from where you live. Farmers, artisans, craftspeople, businessmen, merchants of all kinds had always lived and worked basically in the same place. It might be a storefront downstairs and a place to live upstairs, but they always lived and worked in the same place. until industrialization came along, and then all of a sudden you were living here and working somewhere else. And that somewhere else became defined as a male sphere. Men owned the public sphere, and women were granted control of home and hearth. Became women's sphere. But by the end of the century, we're talking about all of these kind of changes, by the end of the century we see another shift because we're further along in industrialization. We have a more potent economy now. We're not kind of self-disciplined about everything, and all of a sudden all of these men who had gone to an office, gone to a workplace, become middle managers, created the middle class, all of a sudden they start looking around and realizing they're not quite as strong as those men who are still laborers. They're not quite as strong as those men who are lifting heavy things and out on the farm and working hard. They aren't, maybe that's a problem. And all of a sudden, we have a new definition of masculinity that you will recognize because it's a muscular definition of masculinity, of manliness. This is the term they used. We have muscular Christianity. We have the development of the YMCA. We have the modern Olympic Games. And we have an embrace of sports. This is when college football and college basketball start in big numbers across the country, is the very turn of the 19th to the 20th century. And some of this is exemplified by somebody else you will have heard of, who's named Teddy Roosevelt. Anyone who knows Teddy Roosevelt, knows of Teddy Roosevelt, might think of him as the Rough Rider going into battle in Cuba. But Teddy Roosevelt started off life as very mild and meek and kind of defined as a sissy. And he decided at some point if he wanted to get into politics, he was going to have to change that image, and so he went out west and shot animals for a while. Became manly, moved back, said, here is how manly I am. And then they started electing him to things. It was weird. But Teddy Roosevelt in some ways becomes that image. And you can see in his story that his definition of manly is not only kind of this hunting image, I'm going to go and kill animals, it is also, I am going to conquer other peoples. I am going to go to Cuba and fight. I am going to go and do these, because conquering other people was how you proved yourself a man. And now we're going to move into the 20th century. And I apologize because this is my area of expertise and my time. And so we're kind of almost going to go decade by decade here, but I'll try not to go too far. The early 20th century sees this embodied masculinity threatened, in part because the World War I draft, there are some states in which half of the men drafted are rejected. They are not fit. To be fair, most of it is for flat feet or venereal disease. But either way, just looking at the numbers and saying half of the men we just drafted are not fit for the military terrified people. Like, what are we doing to our men? And so the explosion, the response to that is we have to be even more masculine. We have to introduce physical fitness classes, and we have to do all of these things to try to make men more manly. And then the 19th Amendment passes. And the 19th Amendment guarantees women the right to vote. But women and men interpret that very differently. Men of the time tend to interpret that as, okay, you get the right to vote, but you still don't know what you're doing. You should go take a civics class because you don't know anything. And women interpret that as, we're now all equal, let's do everything. And that explosion of we are now going to be part of everything. You see it in flapper culture. We can drink and we can smoke just like you. We can vote just like you. You see it there. You see it on college campuses where women start to want to be involved in the college newspaper and the athletic association and the drama club. And the men are like, oh, no, go create your own. Don't be part of ours. Go do your own thing. That clash in some ways defines the 1920s. You see this kind of insistence of being equal at the same time as there's like, we don't know how to treat you if you're going to be equal. We don't know what that means. There is across the United States, and this is one of the things when I study gay and lesbian history that's fascinating to me, because in the 1920s, gay men have apparently a heyday of being out and about, at least in big cities. New York City, George Chauncey has talked about this being a heyday for gay men. And it's a huge time of backlash for lesbians and backlash for all women because they might be lesbians. Crackdown on women's colleges, on any women's clubs and organizations, particularly on women's sports. All of those things, there's a huge backlash against them in the 1920s. And so this contested idea of what's going to happen now that women technically are equal citizens, how does that play out? In some ways, that conversation gets shortchanged by the Great Depression. Because the Great Depression serves really as and is perceived and felt as an emasculization of America. Most of the jobs that are lost are jobs that are done by men. Most of the women who were working for wages, or for families, when a man lost his job, a woman might be able to go out and work and bring home money. But that was not what was told about how the world was supposed to work and how the family was supposed to work. And so the rules had changed. And so men, many of them who have lost their jobs, who are at home, maybe they're not making it as well, maybe their wife is bringing home money, but that doesn't feel good, they go out and they start traveling the country looking for work, which means they've basically abandoned their families. And so in trying to meet up with this one definition of masculinity, they've abandoned another. And it creates this whole issue. And then you add to that the fact that we had, through most of the 30s, a president who himself was pretty much trapped in DC, and his wife was the one going out and bringing him information and going out and touring the country and all that kind of stuff. There is a role reversal here that shakes up our gendered ideas even before we finish that conversation from the 20s, right? And then, of course, we go right into World War II, and that changes things again. It creates a number of things. One is separate, sex-segregated cultures, where men tend to spend most of their time with men, and women are spending most of their time with women. And that has lots of implications for gay and lesbian history. But it also changes the way that men and women relate to each other, particularly when men are called off to war and women are filling in jobs in the factories, right? Rosie the Riveter, et cetera. Well, women are filling in these jobs, and yes, women can do these jobs, and it's a great accomplishment that women can do all the work that they were previously told they would never, ever be able to do. But they're also still expected to take care of the kids at home. And so what some people look at and see as a liberating thing, most of the women who experienced it were like, this is just double duty. When the war ends and women are forced out of the factories, many of them are happy to leave because they don't want to have to keep doing the double duty. But the war does change for men, give them a sense of purpose that had been taken away during the Great Depression, right? A sense of, yes, we have a bigger purpose, we're going to go and we're going to defeat the bad guys. And they came back as heroes, and therefore that creates a dynamic of, yes, you can have all these things you were promised, you can be all that you were told you can be all you can be. But it does create a dynamic of boosting that sense of masculinity. And they come home, and we have the most prosperous economy ever, right? 1950s. Lots of them big union jobs. Men are bringing home more money. They have great benefits. Women are sent home, gladly home. And we have this 1950s dynamic, which in some ways is still fascinating to me, because we have what it's supposed to be, where men are the providers and they go out to work and they come home, and the women are supposed to have the house not only cleaned and the children all looking perfect, but they're also supposed to be sexy while doing it. I've never figured out how to be sexy while vacuuming, but apparently it was expected. What? See, I failed at the high heels part a long time ago, so I guess we just... But part of what the 1950s does, and part of it because of the spread of advertising, right? All of those magazines with all of those pictures of what it's supposed to look like, a lot of it ends up with both men and women feeling incredibly inadequate. And what we see coming out of the 1950s is an increase in the number of bars in the basement. They didn't call them man caves yet, but that basically became what it was, right? And the number of women going to psychiatrists and saying, I just can't fit in. I can't do it, and being prescribed Valium. And of course we know that the children of the 1950s turn instead into the crazy radicals of the 1960s. The counterculture, the rejection of all of that stuff, we're going to go and embrace something totally different. But the 1950s has this idea of what it's supposed to be, and the reality was very different. And that struggle, I think, really did make it difficult for a lot of people. As gender tends to do, when gender defines this is what you're supposed to be and you can't be it, it makes it really hard. And we see that, historians see that in the 50s, even while politicians try to idealize the time. Okay, of course, the other thing that we get out of the 1950s is the baby boom, which is the first time since the 19th century that the birth rate goes up again, right? That's all right, we will fix that in the 1960s, because what comes along in the 1960s? The pill! There's a pill for that. Not only is there a pill in terms of the counterculture and everything that they were doing, but there is a pill, the birth control pill comes along. And the birth control pill, if the Victorian era freed women to say no, the birth control pill frees women to say yes, while it also takes away an excuse to say no. And it's a double-edged sword. It is both a positive and a negative at the time. But that reaction, and a lot of it, again, the reaction to the 1950s, the breaking away of that, you see the rise of the women's movement, civil rights movement, I'll do them back in order. Civil rights movement, women's movement, the gay rights movement, the American Indian movement, all of these things start coming out of, right, from the late 50s through the 60s into the 70s, all of them demanding equality and all of them starting different conversations. But one of the things that I think gets skipped over if we focus on, say, the creation of NOW, the National Organization for Women, or if we focus on some of the legislation that passed, one of the things that gets missed is something called consciousness-raising groups. Anybody know about consciousness-raising groups? What I have always explained to my students is women started talking to each other and all hell broke loose. Because in many ways, when women really sat down and started to talk to each other and said, wait, you feel that too? You went through that? I went through, are you kidding me? That wasn't just me? All of a sudden, domestic violence programs, right? Rape crisis hotlines. All of a sudden, legislation, I'm going to do things. I'm going to try to change things. I'm going to try to change things for everyone because it's not just me. And all of this emerges by the time we get into the 1970s, and this is one of my favorite moments, both looking at it historically and remembering it as a child. There's a tennis match between Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs. And what I remember from that is for weeks, my mother went around singing, "Anything you can do, I can do better." Because she and 40 million other people watched that match. And she and millions of other women across the United States said, "It's true. Wait, I can do that. Whatever that thing was that I was told I was not allowed to do, that I couldn't do, that I wasn't capable of, that wasn't for me, I can claim it now." And that is a switch. It's something that changes. And we get into the 1970s and the 1980s when basically all of this gets contested and talked about and legislated and fought for and against. We get Title IX, right? And we get free to be you and me. And we get the battle over the ERA. And we get a time when people are increasingly talking about what gender means. So as things that were prescribed before, but never described, at least the prescription is being contested in a different way now. And we get there. And I have to say that it intrigues me that this happens really at the same time that for me, what I see is an increasingly gendered society. We start talking about gender more, and there's more pressure put on people to be gendered in particular ways. And if you want an example of this, stores closed now, but think about Toys R Us. And ask yourself why in the world we had a pink side to that store and a blue side to that store. Because if you go back into like the 1950s and earlier, you look at babies and toddlers, and they're almost all in dresses. It's a whole lot easier to change a diaper that way. But this idea of gendering babies, and from then on, that's a more recent idea. That's something that comes along in my lifetime, which, isn't necessarily recent, but feels it, right? That is something that is newer, that everything must be gendered. And all of a sudden we have these gender reveal parties. What? What is that? And I don't want to belabor this, but I do kind of want to think about that, because as we challenge gendered ideas more, the forces that be, including marketing forces, try to reinforce them and emphasize them and make them more important. And the last piece that I'm going to say before I kind of go on, because we get to a point where you need a sociologist and not a historian, right? The last piece I want to say is I was really struck in the 1990s by the way that the word man suddenly became a verb. I still don't know how or why, but all of a sudden it's man up. When did man become a verb? And why? I don't understand it. But I want to bring you back. We started out talking about how gender is socially constructed. And I've told you about how masculinity and femininity have changed. The definitions of those have changed. Prescriptions, often developed based on economic and social changes that had nothing to do with gender, but became gendered. But I want to go back to the gender spectrum that I started out with. Remember when we put the Hulk here and Barbie over there? Yeah? If you think about what I have just offered you, all of these other ways of experiencing gender in the world, suddenly that spectrum isn't a line anymore. Suddenly it's a 3D plane. And you can place yourself anywhere in it. The truth is, the description has always been like that. It's only the prescription that has limited us. And often, like those folks in the 50s, left us feeling inadequate. because we didn't live up to the definitions that never described us to begin with. That's where the socially constructed part becomes really, really important. Because we can change the prescription. We can insist that people can find their own place on the 3D plane. And we, as individuals, as a church, as a society, can reinforce that for them. Yes, you can be wherever you want to be. You can be who you are. As Lauren was saying, you be you. You are loved. That's what we have to offer, is validating any of that stuff. Because it really doesn't matter that I failed Femininity 101. Right? It doesn't matter, because I'm comfortable in the skin that I'm in. And if we all get there, awesome. I don't know if we want to do any questions, or we want to just kind of, I know we were going to we are doing questions? Okay, I just got the thumbs up. I know one of the things that we want to do is we want to let people sit with this and come back next week to have conversations about it, about how it felt, what you think, what matters to you and doesn't matter to you, but we will take some time to take questions now. Yeah, Joni. Sure, the question is basically that the youth these days are fitting more into a category of gender non-conforming. And what do I think about that, and how will that change things? And again, I'm a historian, and so I try not to look into the future. But I'll say two things about that. One is that and this is just me being honest, I hate the term. I hate the term gender non-conforming, because it implies that the gender system is fine for everybody else, I just don't fit into it. And so for that reason, I hate the term, because it's like, no, the gender system is not fine. Like, no. And as a feminist, it's like, no, that we should crush the entire system and just, but I understand where it comes from. Does that make sense? The other thing that I will say about it is, and this is from a historical perspective, George Chauncey, who wrote the book Gay New York, talks about, he's the one who talks about the thriving gay culture in the 1920s. He talks about gay men at the time not talking about a closet. The closet doesn't come until the 1950s. What he talks about is not people coming out of a closet, but out into society, out into a culture and family and stuff. And so the coming out is the same, but there's a different sense. There's no closet, right? And I think in some ways we are seeing that same kind of thing starting now, that there are young people today who've never known a closet, never felt like there was a closet, and the closet doesn't exist for them, right? They just affirmed who they were from the beginning. I think we may see something similar in terms of gender identity. I think that idea of, well, I have to now identify, it may become mute, that there's not a point where, oh, well, this is when I changed my identity, or this is when people noticed that I was different, or that I was the same all along. And I think that we may get there. And that's the thing that I think that they are leading, and I love it. Does that make sense? Yes, Randy.
You mentioned about how there were some laws back in the early 1600s. Have you found, as a historian, that those laws that shaped gender continue to change and be enforced, as we're starting to see some
Yes, we are seeing an awful lot of that. There are literally laws on the books now that said that, well, they are, I don't know if they've passed, they're being proposed and debated in legislatures across the country, saying that if I were standing here in men's clothes, as I tend to be, that especially speaking in front of an audience, and in a church of all places, that I could be arrested for that. Of course, they're not targeting me. Those laws exist, and they do not and will not target me, because for the last 30, 40 years, it has been acceptable for women to wear pants, right? We have created a culture, and this is, again, the socially constructed piece. We did that. We created that it was okay. What they are targeting is drag performers, trans women, and other men who they perceive as dressing as women. That's who they are targeting with that legislation. And I think it's always important to recognize the difference between the way a law is written and its intent and its effect. The people who are affected are usually vastly more than the ones who are targeted, but it's important that we notice who's being targeted, and that's who's being targeted with those laws. There's too many of them. We were going to kind of hold off and talk about this another time, but there are literally hundreds of laws that have been proposed across the country, and more in 2023 than in the past 4 or 5 years combined. They're all anti-trans laws, basically, yes. It is not my area of expertise, but I will say this. I did mention I'm sorry, repeating the question. Can I talk about about the glass ceiling and the ways in which pay inequity is intentional? Does that sum it up? Yeah, it's not my area of expertise, but what I will say is that I started out talking about how things are gendered in our society, and money is one of them. There's a wonderful book called The Social Meaning of Money, and it lays out how through the late 19th century, through the early half at least of the 20th century, men were given a family wage, and women were given pin money for doing the same job. Regardless of whether the women had dependents and the men didn't, it didn't matter. The men were paid a family wage, and women were given pin money because it was assumed that they would just use it for, I don't know, pins, hats, extras, I don't know. I have no idea. Again, I failed Femininity 101. I don't know what these things are. But the idea was that's how money would be used, and so money itself became gendered. And while we have had things like the Equal Pay Act and stuff, it has never cut down, it has diminished the gap between a family wage and pin money, but it has never erased it. That is really enmeshed in our society. In some ways, it is similar to, say, Title IX of the Education Act, which requires that any educational institution live up to this, but its enforcement is minimal. The big thing that the Equal Pay Act did in the 1960s is basically erase the obvious part of it, where they could say, man, in classified ads, say man wanted for this job, or woman wanted for that job. That's, those actually used to be the classified ads. They got rid of that, the most obvious part of it, but the inequity remains, and part of it remains because, of course, you're not supposed to talk about money, right? And therefore, it is allowed to continue. The other part of that I can't really speak to, is the ways people do it intentionally. Leota. One of my favorite books, and can I talk about race relations and how all of this intersects? One of my favorite books is called Manliness and Civilization, written by Gail Baderman, and she breaks down a whole bunch of the terms. So this idea of masculinity is fairly new. The term, the term used at the turn of the 20th century was manliness. And she talks about the ways in which this new definition of manliness was very racialized and was intentionally so. And it is both the way that Teddy Roosevelt kind of defined himself. It is also why the fighter Jack... No, we're talking early, talking 1920. I can't remember his name now. But why it was that he was charged with trafficking across state lines with his white wife. Like, I mean, he was going across state lines with his white wife, but was charged with trafficking. But she also goes into Ida B. Wells, and this is my favorite kind of example, is she looks at Ida B. Wells and talks about how Ida B. Wells could not get, in all of her campaigns across the North, any traction on fighting lynching in the South. So she went to England, because England that at the time was considered the epitome of civilization, and the English would frown upon it and therefore force the white folks in the North to also frown upon it to maybe stop the lynching in the South. Because this idea, if you were manly, you didn't have to do that. She was pitching this. All of these things are very much intertwined with race and class because white men are trying to perpetually position themselves as superior to everyone else. And so it all gets intertwined. Does that help? It's an excellent book, but... Anything else? The right to vote was extended to women. The effect of that was that it was extended to white women. And again, this difference between intention and there are huge divisions that happen in what's called the women's movement in both the 19th century and the 20th century, in what this contestation of what defines woman. And there is a group, the National Women's Suffrage Association breaks apart, becomes the National American Suffrage Association, the National, I don't know, I can't remember all of it, but basically they break apart, and they break apart both on strategy and on ideas of race. What had happened in the Reconstruction period was there was a fight about whether all people would be given the right to vote, or whether only black men would be given the right to vote. And that is a huge fight that ends up dividing both that movement at the time and the women's movement for a very long time. And Frederick Douglass stands up, and Frederick Douglass had been one of the, he'd been at the Seneca Women's Rights Convention, he had been part of the women's movement for a long time, but he stands up and he said, "This is the Negro's hour. Black men deserve the right to vote for all we have suffered." And I think it's Elizabeth Cady, no, it's Susan B. Anthony, stands up and says, no, women need the right to vote too. What? It's Stanton. And of course, they're just completely forgetting black women. They just completely skip over black women in the whole debate. And that continues and persists. So while the 14th and 15th Amendments basically get undermined by things like poll taxes and literacy tests and all that kind of stuff, by the time all women get the right to vote, it has already been chipped away from all black Americans. And so it doesn't effectively reach black women until we get into the 1960s. But you see the same kind of battle over who qualifies as woman in things like the National Organization for Women in the late 1960s and early 1970s. They are fighting for rights for particular women. And most of them are white housewives from the 1950s, and Betty Friedan and folks. Yeah, lesbians get kicked out, black women get kicked out. Yeah, it's nasty. Any other questions? Can't end on that note. Yes?
I'm probably not the only one that would like, if you can do it without too much trouble, list 5 or 6 books that you've recommended.
Sure, I can do that. I have, what? Can I get a list of books to recommend? I can do that. It's going to be hard trying to take a couple shelves and figure out which ones, but I will do that. Or at least I will give you a slightly annotated bibliography that tells you kind of what each one's about so you can figure it out on your own. But there are some really fascinating ones. And I wanted to go back just for a second to the question about money, because one of my favorite books, Kathy Pice's Cheap Amusements, is about the ways in which factory girls created their own kind of sexual currency. Because they knew the men were taking them out, made more money, they figured out, well, this is worth this, and this is worth that, and this is what, no, and they had a whole system that they all talked to each other about. Creating that sexual currency. It was like, that's really fascinating. Anyway. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much.
I just wanted to remind you that next week after services, we're going to have some facilitated conversations. I would love to see you come back, excuse me, and I would love to see you bring as many friends as you can. We'll have small groups or a little bigger groups, but we'll try to accommodate everybody. So thank you for coming today. I would also say, Cindy's waving at me, so I'll stall for a second. If any of you are interested in becoming a part of the ONA group here at First UCC, let me know, let Jackie know, let Cindy know. We'll make sure that you get on our list and we'll put you to work. So there's some important legislation coming up in the next, well, probably the whole legislative session, but it sounds like some of the, I'm drawing a blank, some stuff coming in the next couple of weeks, and so watch the bulletin, because the bulletin doesn't forget. Cindy. And thank you for, not only to those of you who came, but a special thanks to Jackie.